REST APIs are a staple of the web development industry, and the most popular web framework is Express. I've been using Express since 2016 and have built many production-grade APIs that are serving hundreds of thousands of requests per day. By watching this video, you'll learn how to build scalable, production-grade APIs with Express and TypeScript. You'll learn the basics of Express and advanced topics that will keep your API secure, maintainable, and scalable. To follow along with this guide, you'll need 4 tools. An editor, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. You'll need node.js installed. I recommend installing Node via Node Version Manager or NVM. A package manager such as npm or yarn. I'll be using yarn. You'll get npm when you install Node. And something to send HTTP requests to your API. I'll be using Postman. If you need to install any of these tools, now is a good time to pause the video and go and get these tools. So this is the structure that the video will be following. We're going to be getting started and we're going to bootstrap our application. We're going to dive into routing. Then we'll be taking a look at middleware. We'll be taking a look at error handling, application structure, and finally security. So let's get started by bootstrapping our application. I'm in the terminal here and I'm going to type npx tsc with the init flag, and this is going to create a tsconfig file for us. And if we open up our file explorer, you can see here we have a tsconfig file. Next, we'll do yarn init, and this is going to initialize our node.js application. And we can press enter for all these questions. So the next thing we need to do is to make a source directory. So I can do mkdir and I can say source. And then I'm going to create a new file inside our source directory called app.ts. So I'm going to say touch source/app.ts. And if we open up our source directory, you'll see we have an app.ts. The first thing that we need to install is going to be ts node dev. So we can say yarn add ts node dev. I'm also going to install TypeScript. And these are going to be dev dependencies. So I'm going to use the dash and capital D. So I'm going to open up my package.json. And I'm going to create a new entry in here. And this is going to be called scripts. And I'm going to make one script, and this is going to be called dev. You can call it start or start dev, whatever you like. And I'm going to say ts node dev, and I'm going to give it the path to my app.ts. So I'm going to open up app.ts, and I'm just going to console log in here. And say hello world. Now I can type yarn dev in the console, and I should see hello world get printed to the console. So we see hello world here, and the application just exits. To make sure our application doesn't exit every time and just sits here and watches the file, I'm going to do -- respawn. And I'm also going to do -- transpile only. Now I'm going to type yarn dev again. And you can see here we get hello world. And if we save this file, it should restart the server and hello world prints again. So let's stop the server, and I'm going to say yarn add express. And once that's installed, because we're going to be using TypeScript as well, I'm going to say yarn add @types/node and @types/express. And I'm going to install these as dev dependencies. So while those are installing, we can get started bootstrapping our application. So I'm going to import Express from Express. I'm going to say const app equals Express. And our first route is just going to be hello world. I'm going to say app.get. And routes take a callback. So I'm going to pass in a callback here. And the first parameter is the request object, and the second parameter is the response. There is a third parameter called next that we'll go over soon. And I'm going to return res.send, and I'm just going to put a string in here that says hello world. The next thing I'm going to do is listen and serve. So I'm going to say app.listen. And I'm going to pass in a port here. So I'm going to pass in port 3000. And then this takes a callback. And I'm just going to console.log application listening at HTTP localhost and then port 3000. So I'm going to say yarn dev. And I've missed the route in here, so this won't work. I'm just going to make this the index file. So you can see here, application listening at port 3000. So let's make a curl request to this application and see what it returns. So I can type curl and pass in the address of the server, and we get hello world back. So because this is a GET request, we can also make this request in the browser. So if I come over to a browser, I can put the address into the address bar, and you can see we get hello world back. So let's talk more about routing. So we have a GET request here that is listening on this path here, which is the index. And then we get the request object, and then we have a response object. So if we wanted to make a handler for a post request, we would simply say app.post. And then we can pass in the path here. So I can say /API/data. And we simply pass in a callback here. So this is the request and this is the response object. So I'm going to console.log the request.body because a post request can have a body. And I'm going to return res.send status. And I'm just going to send back a 200 request, and a 200 is okay. So let's go over to Postman and test out this endpoint. So I can put my URL in the address bar up here, and I can change this to a post request. And I can say /API/data. And let's try put some data in the body. And I'm going to change this to raw, and then I'm going to change the type to JSON. I'm going to add test, and this is going to be true. Let's send this request, and we can see we get back a 200, okay. And let's have a look, and you notice here that we get undefined. And this is because by default, Express won't pass the request body. So to fix this problem, it's quite simple. We're going to say app.use, and I'm going to say express.json. And this means that we can now pass JSON bodies. If we want to be able to pass URL encoded bodies, we're going to do app.use express .url encoded. And I'm going to pass in an option here, and this option is going to be extended, and I'm going to set this to true. But if you don't need to pass URL encoded bodies, I suggest that you don't add this. And for now, we're just going to pass JSON encoded bodies. Let's go back to Postman, and we can send this request again. And you can see here that we get the JSON body. So this here is middleware, and we're going to talk more about middleware later on, about how to create your custom middleware and how to use third-party middleware. So the final listener that you would use a lot is going to be app.all. And this is going to listen to all HTTP methods. So if we have a look at what we can use, You can see here we have get and post and put. We have delete. And we should also have patch. And these are all HTTP methods. So I'm going to say app.all. And I'm going to say /API/all. Let's pass in our request and our response. And again, I'm just going to return res.sendStatus. And the status is going to be 200. So let's go test out our all endpoint. So let's start off with a GET request. So I can send this, and you can see that we get a 200. If we send a POST request, we should also get a 200. If we send a PUT request, we should also get a 200. And we're going to get a 200 for all these methods. If we send a request to /all/nothing, for example, we should get a 404. And that's because this route doesn't exist. So because we're using TypeScript, we will want to type this request object and our response object. So let's come up to our Express import, and we're going to also import a request interface, and we're going to import a response interface. Now we can type our request and response. And we can copy and paste this. Now, if we're unsure what we can do with these two objects here, we can say res dot, and you can see all the methods that are available on this interface. If you want to explore it further, you can command click on the interface and you'll dive into the definition. And that's the same for the request object. So let's talk more about responses. So here we're just sending a piece of data. But there's a few other responses we can use. We can use res.end, which will end the response process. We can use res.json, which will send a JSON response. We can use res.jsonp, which will send a JSON response with JSONp support. We can do res.redirect, which will send a redirect request. Res.render, which will render a view template. Res.send, which will send a response of various types. We can do res.sendFile, which will send a file as an octet string. And we can do res.sendStatus, like we do down here, and this will just send a status code. So let's try a few of these methods. Let's do res.json, and we're going to put a JSON payload in here. So I'm going to say success is true. Name is TomDoesTech. Let's send a GET request to the index. And you can see if we send this POST request, we get a 404 because we're not listening for a POST request on the index. So we need to change this to a GET request. And you can see we get our JSON payload here. And let's add a res.redirect. And we're going to redirect them to http:/example.com. And we can send our request again. And you can see that we get a 200 and we've been redirected to this example domain. If you don't want Postman to follow the redirect, you can turn off this automatically follow redirects. We'll turn this off and we get the response found redirecting to example. So we've seen how we can create individual requests here, but we can also chain requests. Let's remove these requests here and we can say app.route. And I'm going to have a route on /index. Then I can say .get. And we can pass in our request and our response. And let's type these objects. And for our GET request, we're just going to return res.send you made a GET. request. We can also do a .post. Let's copy our callback from our GET request, paste it into our post. So for our post, we can say res.send, you made a post request. And let's do a put. So we can say .put. We can copy our callback here. And now we can say you made a put request. Let's go over to Postman and we can try these out. We'll make our GET request first. Then you made a GET request. Try a post request. You made a post request and a put. Now let's send a delete request. And we're going to get a 404. To fix this, we can say .all. Paste in our callback. And we can say you made an X request. Now we get you made an X request. And this is really nice if you want to change some CRUD operations for a specific resource. So for example, you might have /API/books. And this will be to get a list of books. This will be to create a book. This will be to update a book. And then you would remove this. And you might also want a delete. So let's talk about route paths. So a route path can be either a string pattern, or a regular expression. Let's remove this and say @.get. And we can say /help. And this is just a string. We can create a string pattern. So we can say /ab times cd. And let's send. And we can send this string back. And this will match ABCD. It will match ABXCD. And it will match AB, some random letters in between, and CD. Or you could have a regular expression. So instead of a string here, we do //, and I can put an ABC. Now we can send back ABC. And let's go to Postman and try these. Let's do /health. We'll send a GET request. And we get back a 200. Let's try ABCD. And you can see we get our AB times CD response. Let's do ABXCD. And you can see we get the same response. And let's put some random characters in the middle here. And we get the same response. So let's do ABC. And you can see we get our ABC. And this is from our regular expression. The next thing to talk about is route parameters. So often you'll want to put a dynamic path inside your route. So let's say app.get. We'll say /API/books. And we want to have a book ID here. So we can get access to this parameter by saying rec.params. And let's console log this rec.params. And we're going to return rec.params. Let's go over to Postman and try this out. And we can replace book ID with 123. And you can see we get book ID 123. So we can say this is a book ID. We can send that and we get our book ID. So to access this book ID, we're obviously going to say rec.params.book ID. So if we send this request again, you can see here that we get this is a book ID printed to the console. We can have multiple params here and we can just add them in like this. So we'll say author ID. And let's print our params again. And I'm going to say /1. And you can see here we get author ID of 1 and book ID, this is a book ID. We can set params in Postman. So I can say book ID / author ID. And we can set these values here. So I can say book ID is 1 and author ID is 2. Send this request and it has replaced our book ID and author ID in the URL. And this is really nice because you can just copy this from your Express application. So let's dissect the components of a route handler. So you can see here we have our method, and then we have our path here, and then we have a callback function here. And these callback functions work the same as middleware. And the third property on this callback is going to be next. And we can type this with next function. And you can see it comes from Express as well. So I can move this function out of here and I can name it. So I can say function handle get book. Now I can replace this function in my route. Let's go over to Postman and we should expect this to have the same functionality, and it does. We can have multiple route handlers and we can do this by calling next. So let's copy this function here. I'm going to call this handle get book 1 and I'm going to call this handle get book 2. And inside this function here, I'm just going to call next. I'm going to log second handler, and we're just going to send back the params. So let's add these in as an array. And we'll go back to Postman and we'll check out what it does. So we send the request and it sends our response back. We get our params logged and we get second handler logged. So these are going to get hit in order. You don't have to split these out like this. So you can say function. And then I can put in a new function. And in this first function, I can just call next. And then I can do the same in this function. So I can send the params along. But this is a little bit nicer if you split these out into separate functions. So let's talk about middleware. So you can see here we have our route path and we have a handler here. But if we put a different function inside of here, like we did with this handle get books 1, this is considered middleware. And this middleware can do whatever you like. So we can alter the request object. So we can say rec.name equals Tom. And we can TS ignore this for now. If you want to do things like this, it's nicer if you use something like lodash.set. So let's put our middleware back into our route. And I can remove our second handler. And inside our route handler, I can just do console.log rec.name. And we should expect this to log Tom. And you can see our request is just hanging here. And this is because in our middleware, we're not calling next. So our request gets to our middleware and then it doesn't know what to do. You need to call this next function so it knows to move on to the second piece of routing. Send our request. And you can see we get Tom logged to the console, but we also get a mysterious 404. So let's fix that by calling res.send. And I'm just going to return the rec.name. And we're going to need another TSIgnore in here because this is a custom parameter that Express doesn't know about. And we get Tom. So you can create route middleware and you can add multiple bits of route middleware by putting an array. Or you can create global middleware. So to create global middleware, we're just going to create a function called middleware, and we're going to append our name called Tom to the request.name. And we want to apply this to every single route in our application. So let's say app.use, and I'm just going to pass in my middleware, and that's all you do. So let's send this request again. And you can see we get Tom back. If you want to create a customizable piece of middleware, we can use a programming technique called currying. So our middleware here is going to be a function that returns a function. So I'm going to put a name in here and I'm going to type this out. Our name needs to be a string. So when we call our middleware, we're going to say a name is now TomDoesTech. So we can get our name from here, rec.name equals name. And we need another arrow here. And this needs to be a constant. So now we should expect our name to be TomDoesTech. And it is. So how this works is our function gets called once here, and this function will return this new function. And this new function will have the name set as its property, as a property in the function. And this technique is called currying. So if we only want to apply this middleware to routes that are after a certain point, we can move this endpoint above where we apply the middleware. And now let's see what happens. So we define our route and then we define our middleware. And you can see that our name is undefined. And that's because you need to set app.use and your middleware above any route that you want to use that middleware. So this is a TypeScript tutorial, so having these TSIgnores here is not good enough. So there's a few different ways to fix this. One way would be to use low-set, or a better way for this particular circumstance would be to put the name on res.locals. So we can say res.locals.name equals name. And now we just need to change these references down here to res.locals.name. And we can remove these TSIgnores. And you can see that we will now have the name on res.locals. So if we want to type a request body or request params, we can have a look at the request interface here, and we can see that it is a generic. So you can see here we have p equals core.params directory, res body equals any, rec body equals any, request query equals past query strings. And so we can pass in our generic params here, and we can pass in some empty objects. And so if we want to type out the request params, for example, we would put those in the first object here. So we can say name, and we expect it to be a string. So now we can say rec rec.params dot, and you can see we get name here. But more appropriate for this request, we would have a book ID, and we would also have an author ID. You can see now we have our book and author ID on params. If we wanted to type the request body, we can hover over request again, and we can see that params is 1, res body is 2, and rec body is 3. So we'll come down to the third object, and in here we'll put a name, and we'll set that to string. So now we can say rec.body dot, and we get a name. Good error handling is a must-have in every production grade application. If you don't handle errors properly, it can lead to all sorts of unexpected behavior, and it can lead to memory leaks. So Express comes with some great error handling, and this will differ slightly between Express 4, which we're using, and Express 5. Out of the box, Express can handle errors. So let's create an endpoint here called /error. And I'm just going to throw a new error here. And this is just going to say boom. And if we send a GET request to this endpoint, you can see here that we get a 500 internal server error. And Express has handled this error for us. So if we want Express to handle async errors, we can create an async function throws error. And I can move this error up into this function. I can change our callback to an async function. I can say await throws error. And then say res.send going to be okay. We need to define request and response. So in Express 4, this is just going to hang here, and that's because we're not capturing this error. In Express 5, this error will be captured, the same as if the error was in the route like it was before. So to do this in Express 4, we're just going to use a try catch block. And this is generally a good idea for all your errors. So you can return the response status code and you can log the error. So now we're just going to catch this error and we're going to res.send status. And our status is going to be a 400. And if we want to send a message along with this status code, I can say res.status. And then I can do .send. And we're going to say something bad happened. And if our async function succeeds, I'm going to do res.send status of 200. Let's send our request again. And you can see we get a 400 and we get our message here as well. Something bad happened. So I advise wrapping all your async code in try catch and sending along the appropriate error message, depending on what your error is. And this will mean that your applications run smoothly and you're always telling the user and logging what has happened in the application. So let's talk a little bit about application structure. The application structure is important. A good application structure will keep your application maintainable. So in a previous video I did on Express APIs, I recommended a pattern that is controller service model, and I would still recommend that pattern. So what I would do is I would create a new file and I would call this routes. And I would define all of my routes in this file. So let's just use this one route here. And I will create a function. And I'll put my routes in here. Call this function routes. And I would pass in app. And this is going to be type of Express. And we can import Express from Express. And we can also import our request, response, and next. If you're getting some funny errors here on your request and response, make sure you've imported it from Express and you've installed the Definitely Types package. See, if I remove request from here, you can see that it's not telling me that request is undefined. It's giving me this no override matches this call error, and this can be quite confusing. Generally, it's because you haven't imported that type from Express. So let's export default routes. And inside our application, I would call routes, and we can pass in our app here. Next, I would make a controllers folder. And I would make a new file inside of their controllers for each resource type. So in this case, we have books. So I would make a new file called books. And I would call this books.controller.ts. I would move this function here into our books controller. So I'd say function get book handler. Then I would put this function in here. And then the controller, if you're going to make database calls, I would make a new folder called services. And inside here, I would create a books.service, .ts. And this is where I would make my database calls. And if you want to have a model for your database, I would make a new folder. And I would call this, surprise, surprise, models. And then, you guessed it, I would create a books.model.ts. And so services would import the models, the controller would import services, and your routes would import controllers. This is just one way of structuring your application, but it's one that I've followed for quite some time now, and it's been really good. Another way of structuring your application would be to create folders for each resource. So you could create a new folder here called books, and you could move your controller into that folder. You would also move the model into that controller, so into the books folder, and you would have your service in the books folder as well. And a very popular backend library called nest.js does the folder structure just like this. So let's talk a little bit about application security. So security is a really big topic and not one that I could cover in this video because a lot of security issues come down to a poor implementation of business logic. But from an application point of view, there's one simple fix we can make to our Express application, and that's adding a piece of middleware called helmet. So let's yarn add helmet, and we can import helmet from helmet. Now we're going to call app.use, and I'm going to pass in helmet. So let's add a route here. So we say app.get. So I just have an index route here, and let's make a request to that, and we can see what helmet has done. Before we do that, you can see in this response here, we have this X powered by Express. Take note of that. Let's send this request again. So when you use helmet, you need to execute the function. So you need to say helmet and then add the execution brackets, and we can send this request. And you can see we have no X powered by here anymore, but we get all these new headers. And these headers are recommended to keep your application safe. You can customize these headers if you like, but I find the headers that Helmet adds by default are really good. So that is Express with TypeScript. If you like the video, please make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.